everyone, my name is Phil and welcome to Phil Does 3D. I'm a multimedia and 3D artist and I stream on Twitch weekdays from 10 AM Pacific time in the United States, 5 PM, no, let's start that again. I stream from 5 PM Pacific time in the United States, 10 AM in Australia and 1 AM in the UK. There we go. You think after all this time I get it right. We are working on an Art Deco building in the Unreal Engine 4.16.2. We've created our environment. We're working on the interior of the Art Deco building at the moment. I hope you guys had a good weekend and you're ready to get into this. So I think what I'll do is this is the actual Art Deco building in Max that we've brought into Unreal, and we're working on the interior at the moment because we're going to create a cinematic where we fly through our environment into the building and back out again. I'm going to play a video that has the environment, they're just stills of the environment. The actual environment will be fully animated, wind animated, so all the trees move, all the grass moves, all that sort of stuff. I won't turn it on in Unreal simply because OBS really hates it. It hates the real-time aspect of Unreal. So I'll just let that play through and have a drink while that's going. So this is the environment that we've created in Unreal that our camera will fly through before we actually enter the Art Deco building. Remember guys, if you've got any questions or anything you're not sure about, please feel free to pop into chat and ask me. Bit of background on me, I'm an archviz artist at the moment. I've worked in games development in the past as well as in film. I've been in 3D for more than 10 years now, so if you've got a question regarding 3D, please feel free to pop into chat and ask me. I don't know everything, I'm not going to say that I could probably answer every question you have, but I'm willing to try. If you just want to pop into chat and say hello, then that's always welcome. If you just want to watch, then that's completely fine. Let's turn that up. Let's jump into Unreal. So this is the environment inside of the building that we're working on. We have been working on this central front hallway here. I think last week we were working on the curtains. We're going to continue working on our building. We have done some interior parts here, but we haven't fleshed out the middle of the building or the back of the building yet. It's mainly the front of the building we've been working on. I think what we'll do is we'll work our way through our building sort of like a room at a time, starting from the front and heading toward the back. Now, I've actually, since last week's stream, imported a few of these hanging lights. I don't know if you can see them up here. Let's zoom up here. These hanging lights will sway backwards and forwards in the gently in the breeze. If I turn on real time or simulate here, you can get an idea of that. So I've actually added it as it's a physics object, so it will actually move in the wind. Let's just zoom back a little bit. So it just sways in the breeze, has a small twist to it. I don't know if we wait long enough, we'll see the actual shadow move. I might just pull back. I think probably the shadow here is more easily noticed, I think. So if we look at the wall here, we can see the shadow gradually moving. And that's just as these hanging lights sort of rotate around and sway in the breeze. Just to add a little bit more interest in our level. Maybe if I look up, we can see it better. So what I've done here is, I'll just stop the simulation. I've attached this what do we call it, the thruster, I'm really calling it a thruster, to the side of the physics object. That's simply to keep the object slightly moving. Otherwise, with a physics object, unless something hits it, it has a tendency to sometimes stop moving, that is. by attaching a thruster to it with a very low value, it just helps to ensure that hanging light constantly moves for us. So I've added 2 of them there. I'll add them throughout the building, just depending on the room that we're working on. I'll probably add 2 to the upper level. Now what I've done here is, if we look at these frames that are around the doorway, I've reused that asset, and I've reused it to do the window frames on the arched windows here. So these 2 side pieces and the top pieces is a new imported mesh, but the 2 side pieces are reused from the doorway, just scaled down. And again, I'm doing that to save on polygon count and on texture memory. Now last week, I think the Spawnbox and I were talking about instancing in Unreal, and there was a bit of confusion over exactly how Epic Games have implemented their instancing in the engine. So let's just talk about that quickly, because I did some research over the weekend. Now, reusing assets, creating a level in a modular form like this where you reuse assets is still a very good way to go. It's still the preferred way to go, because you're going to save on poly count and memory. I'm calling them like a half instance. So basically, like I said, reusing an asset is still going to save you on polygon count and on memory. Basically, what happens is, once you load it into the content browser here, it will be loaded into memory as long as it's used in the level. Only once. So the poly count will only be read in once, and the memory, the texture memory for that object will only be read in once. So reusing assets is still the best way to go. And it is like an instance in that you're only using the polygon count once, and it's only loading in the texture into texture memory once. It's not a true instance in Unreal terms unless you do it more like what they're calling a hardware. I'm calling a hardware instance. We were talking about these curtains here. Each of these tassels is an instance, and these now are a proper hardware instance. The way we did it at the end of last week, where I was duplicating each tassel and moving it along and then creating a blueprint, is like a half instance. But if we jump into our blueprints folder and look at that asset now, where are we? This one here, I think. I'm just going to open up the blueprint and we'll go into the viewport. Now, each of these is an actual hardware instance, in that Squawkbox was completely correct. An instance, you have to add an instance mesh component. And then on that instance mesh component, at the top here, you pick the static mesh you want to instance, which in our case is one of these tassels. And then you have to add the instances, or each one of the different tassels, as in an array here as an instance. And you'll see here that all of my tassels are instanced in this array. So there's 54 tassels, or 55 because it starts at 0. And they're all a proper hardware instance. So in other words, the engine is only reading the one tassel in, and then in the GPU, it's actually rotating and moving that tassel around the outside edge. Which of course does mean if we change the text, if we change the polygons used in this tassel or the texture, it's going to change for all of them. But the only way to do that properly in Unreal is to actually create a component, an instanced mesh component, and add it in the array, and add the object you want to instance in the array. The benefit of doing it this way, like I said, is the engine is still only reading in the one tassel, but it's also saving on draw calls, and that's what we were talking about last week. Doing it this way, where we just duplicate the asset, like I said, it's still going to give you the benefit of reducing your poly count and reducing your memory. The engine is still only reading in, let's pick this asset here. It's still only reading it in once. But for every time you reuse that asset, it's going to increase the draw call. So, and draw calls are something, if you have too many, that can slow the engine down. So just to clear up everything, I know it gets a bit confusing here. It's still the best way to create levels, in my opinion, and backed up by a few people, is to instance geometry as much as you can. Do remember though, every time you do a duplicate, I don't want to call it an instance, every time you duplicate and reuse geometry in the editor here like this, so by selecting the object and either going duplicate or copy paste or just dragging out another one from the content browser, you're still saving on polygons because it's only read that object into memory once. You're still saving on texture memory because it's only reading in the texture once, but you are increasing the draw calls for every time you use it. Now, to get the complete hardware instance, you have to create it through the blueprint with an instance static mesh component and add them through an array. Now, doing it this way has its limitations as well, as we were talking about last week, because you have to be careful if you're adding them as a hardware instance this way with lodding, because if you've got something in the foreground and something in the background and they're both part of the one hardware instance, it's going to load the one in the background, which means it's going to load the one in the foreground, and that's not what you want. So in this case with the tassels, it'll work for us because they're all always going to be next to each other. But if my tassels were spread out along the ground, maybe, like just scattered along the ground into the background, it probably would not be a good way to do it. So just to clear up what's going on with Unreal and instancing. So again, like I've been saying all along, modular level design and reusing assets is the best way to go as far as performance for your game would go. But you are going to increase the draw call for every time you make a duplicate of your object. But you're going to do that if you bring in a new object anyway. So it's still the best way to go. So even though you're not reducing the draw calls, you are reducing the polygon memory and texture memory. If you do want to reduce, again, like I said, the draw calls, you should create a blueprint and use more like a hardware instance in a blueprint. Now, there's another option as well. Epic Games introduced in 4.15, I think it was, the option to merge meshes. So you could select a whole heap of meshes and there's a command to merge them. That will reduce your draw call. And that's another option as well, but you're really losing the benefit then of, I haven't used the merge command much myself because it's pretty new to the engine. I think Epic introduced it to try and reduce the amount of draw calls that you would use if you started creating modular assets like we're using, but unless you're using maybe like 1,000 rocks scattered across a landscape that you want to, which will create like 1,000 draw calls, even if you're copying and pasting them or duplicating them, they added it so you could merge all of those rocks into one object, which would reduce your draw calls. So it's good for things like that, but for what we're working on here, it's not really that useful. Like if I go out into the environment here and look at our rocks, if I had thousands of these rocks scattered everywhere, it'd probably be good for me to merge them into one asset to reduce the draw calls. And things like the foliage, Epic handle instancing of foliage in a different way. Again, it's all more handled by the engine when you use the foliage tool. And it's more like a hardware instance, but again, that's all done automatically by the engine when you paint in your foliage. But things like the rocks, like I said, if you had 500 of these rocks scattered all over the landscape, even though they're duplicates of the same rocks, we'll be adding draw calls for each one of those rocks that's scattered about. And in that case, maybe selecting them and merging them into one object, well, that will certainly reduce your draw call. Again, though, like I said, for what we're doing here in this building, hang on, my mouse is going a bit funny here. For what we're doing in this building, it's really not that useful for us. So we're still going to be duplicating our assets to save poly count and to save memory. And for any bits and pieces like these tassels that would benefit from more hardware instancing, we're going to use the blueprint static mesh instance to do that. There aren't many areas though like that. It's really only the curtains that need it. So I just wanted to go through that briefly because we were talking about it at the end of last week's stream. All right. So, I think what we might do is let's work on this upper level for a little while. And we can start by finishing off plaster work on the walls here, I think. So I'm going to duplicate. Now again, I do duplicate because it's quicker than doing copy paste. It achieves the same thing. You're still going to be only using the one asset. Even if you do a copy and paste, you're not increasing your poly count at all. So you still get the same benefit, but duplicate's easier because it's one command as opposed to two. Let's move that along. And again, I'm reusing my geometry here to save on my poly count memory, save on my polygon memory and my texture memory. But each time I do a duplicate, it is going to increase the draw call, so it's going to add a draw call. But again, we're not doing this 1,000 times, so it's not really that much of an issue. Making sure my panels here line up. And I'm going to scale this one down just a little bit. I'm going to scale it back up just a little bit. Let's duplicate it again for the next one down. Just making sure these panels are actually lined up, touching each other. Again, my apologies if you can hear any work going on in the background. They're renovating a building next door. Should be good. I'm just going to pull this column back a little bit so we don't see the brickwork behind it there. I think that means we may need to I'm just checking these ones to make sure that they're not actually, we're not seeing any brickwork. And I think we're going to have to pull out this one a little bit more. And move you over a little bit more as well. And take these ones over a little bit. All right. I'm going to scale this column a little bit more as well. There we go. Let's duplicate this one again. And so long as we don't do any major scales like this, we can get away with using the same asset again and again. Small adjustments no one's going to notice in your level. Hey Sniper Echo, good to see you. I'm good buddy, how are you? We are just working on our level. Did you have a good weekend? Get up to anything interesting? I still want to get out and see some movies, but I'm just too snowed under with work. Looks like we need to bring it out a little bit more. How's your level going as well? You done your work on it, or are you still taking a bit of a break from it? I know sometimes it can be good to take a break from these things if you start getting a bit sick of what you're doing. Alright. Okay, so we have our plaster sections, and again, you see what I've done here. I've just got a few different plaster pieces. I have one long piece here. I have more of a square piece which we're going to use above the windows. And this one's not high enough, okay. Let's scale this one up a bit more. Although that's going to be hidden pretty much by the window framing when we put it in. More like it is here, although this one, I think what I may do is I may bring this one down a little. We'll worry about this window box separately. We may have to jump into max for that. Alright. So again, just to explain for the benefit of anyone, what we're doing, we're reusing the assets as much as we can. Again, like I was saying, we were talking with Squawkbox last week about instancing in the engine, and a proper true hardware instance in Unreal can only be done through a blueprint, but you're still, this is like a half instance where you copy and reuse geometry, because you're still saving on polygon count, you're still saving on texture memory, you're only adding draw calls every time you do a duplicate. So it's still the best way to go. But if you're doing a proper hardware instance in Unreal, you really have to do that through the blueprint. So you're working on the level, you're looking to try out and capture some good textures. Oh, cool. Yeah, like I was saying to you guys, it's you got your mobile phone with you all the time, so use that when you're out and about to take some photographs. Just take a few photos of anything you find interesting that you can then bring in and use as a texture. That's what I do, and that's why I have on my hard drive a separate folder of textures, and I've probably got a few thousand textures in it, just from every time I go out and about taking photographs with either my mobile phone camera, or the DSLR camera if I have it on me. Because you never know when you're going to need a texture, and having it in a library on your hard drive is going to save you a whole heap of time. And you'll be able to create a more variety of work as well, because you'll have a whole library of textures you can draw from. And then let's not forget mixing and matching textures in Photoshop, which is another avenue as well. You take 2 or 3 different textures and you mix them together in Photoshop using different layer styles. Can give you some really interesting looks as well. I do that quite a bit as well. If I'm not using a 3D paint program like Mari or Substance Painter, I'll do my texture mixing in Photoshop and do it that way. But yeah, getting back to our instancing here, because I don't want to give you guys the wrong information. Duplicating an asset in the level using a modular approach is still the best way to go. You're still going to use the least amount of polygons and the least amount of texture memory. So you're going to be saving memory. But to get a proper hardware instance where you also save on draw calls, you have to do that by using an instance static mesh component in the blueprint, and then adding the instance object in an array like I have here. So each of these tassels is a true hardware instance in the engine. Only read in once, and then it's put in an array to duplicate it all the way around the outside of the curtain. But like I said, there are limitations doing it this way with lotting. You've got to be really careful with lotting in your level. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems. I know Sniper Echo, the only reason I bring this up again is you were telling me, you were talking about blueprints though. You were saying that when you created a blueprint, you found it was slowing your level down. Now, I can only assume maybe what might help you is to create a proper hardware instance for whatever it is you're creating in your blueprint to speed it up. I'm just trying to think of ways that you could speed up the engine, because I know you said you were having problems creating a blueprint, slowing the engine down. And certainly if you've got a lot of objects in that blueprint you're making, creating an instance static mesh in an array might help speed it up for you. I just thought I wanted to mention that for you, just in case you can get a benefit from it, or for anyone else watching, not just for Sniper Echo. So we're reusing the assets here we've used around the doorway. We're going to be doing that up here on the window for our window frames. So this is a blueprint, but it's just duplicates of the ones on the door downstairs that I've shrunk down to fit our window. And again, we're creating, I have these physics-based hanging lights here, which if I turn on and stimulate, we can see moving. And again, that's just to add a little bit more interest in our level. The shadows as well. The light is a movable light that's attached to the hanging light fitting. So when the light fitting rotates and swings, the actual shadow moves as well. Yeah, and like I said, I've done that just so that when we do our cinematic and our camera flies through, it creates a bit more interest to have a few more things moving inside the building, because we have all of our environment moving in the wind and looking nice. So we want a bit of movement happening here inside the building as well. So I'm going to add some physics objects here and there just to add a little bit of, it's difficult to see because the movement is very subtle. again, we're indoors, so it's not blowing a gale in here and moving things around really wildly. But just some subtle movement, particularly if we have a still camera, will help to sell the building, believability of the building. 3D Think Tank. Oh, thank you, 3D Think Tank. And thanks for popping into chat too. So yeah, just a few physics objects placed here and there with some subtle movement can really help to sell the realism of whatever it is you're doing. Particularly, like I said, because our environment outside is fully animated, so all of the trees and things move. We don't want, when we move our camera through our environment, which is all nicely animated, when we get into the building, to make it look like the the building's frozen in time and there's nothing going on and nothing moving. So just a few physics objects here and there to help sell the believability of the interior. Again, I'm just keeping an eye on OBS because it hates real time here in Unreal. Sniper Echo, you noticed that if you add all the instances of the mesh to an array inside of a blueprint instead of duplicating with the single mesh, it worked. Yeah, I was talking to Spawnbox at the end of last week's stream. We were talking about this. I'm just going to stop real-time simulation here. Yeah, well, that's when you're doing it that way, which is the way I've done it here with this curtain. So we create an instant static mesh component, and then we add an array of the instances that we're copying. That is a true hardware instance. Let's call it that, so we don't get confused. That's more like a hardware instance in Unreal. So basically, the GPU is doing all of the work for the asset, in that it's only reading in one of those tassels, and then it's just moving and rotating it however many times you need it, in our case 54 times. And that's done only through using an instant static mesh component and an array. But you are still going to get the benefit here of doing a duplicate on assets. So if I wanted to copy this column and I duplicate it, you don't have to duplicate it, you can copy it and paste it. That'll work as well. We're still benefiting from only reading in the polygons once and the memory and the texture once. So we're still saving poly memory and texture memory, but I am adding on the draw call. And thank you 3D Think Tank for the follow. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Again, I stream on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, but not at the moment because I've got too much work on at the studio. But every Monday and Tuesday, 5 p.m. Pacific in the US, I'm streaming live. If you see my channel go live on Saturday, it's a vodcast. But I'm generally in chat at the beginning of the podcast for a little while. So yes, doing a duplicate here, you're still saving. It's like I'm still calling it an instance. It's not a true hardware instance though. This is why I got out of games development, because it's a little bit more complicated than just doing 3D work, rendering work. So again, I want to be clear because I know it can get very confusing. Like I said, doing a duplicate or a copy and paste or just dragging out another asset, the same asset again from the content browser here, they all do the same thing. So you don't need to duplicate it to get the benefit of the same poly and the same texture memory. You can copy and paste, or you can just drag out another one from the content browser. Because every time an object is loaded into the content browser and then used in your level, it's only referenced once from the content browser. So you're still saving on your polygons, you're still saving on your texture, but you are adding a draw call for every time you add another object. And it's the draw calls that will slow the engine down if you have too many of them. Now in our case, where we're only doing it at most maybe, and I'll say at most 10 times for one asset, that's not going to increase our draw call hugely. But for something like our curtains here, where we're duplicating a tassel, which is used 54 times around the outside edge, that can start to add up. Sniper Echo is asking what happens for me is he creates a blueprint and add the instant static mesh to it, then duplicate that blueprint and you get a big drop in frames per second doing it that way. Adding them to an array works perfectly. No, well, adding them to an array is the best way to do it, in that that's more like a hardware instance. So doing it in an array is the best way to go, so long as you don't have something in the background in that blueprint as well as in the foreground, because then you're going to get lodding problems. Because it's going to load the object in the background, which means where the camera is, it's also going to load the one in the foreground. So you have to be careful even doing it this way through the blueprint as well. So while this is the best way to go for creating a hardware instance, you've got to be careful that you don't have anything in this blueprint in the foreground as well as way in the background, because it's going to load and it's going to look weird in your level. It's going to be loaded in the foreground when it shouldn't be. So yeah, no, doing it as an array here in a blueprint is the best way to go. You're going to save on your polys like you are the other way. You're going to save on your texture memory like you still are the other way. But you're also going to save on your draw calls, and it's the draw calls that slow the engine down, or can, if you've got a lot of objects. So by all means, doing it through as an array in a blueprint is a proper hardware instance, and it's the best way to go. It'll save the most performance in your game. But there are instances where you can't do that because of the lodding problem. And that's more to do with you've got stuff in your blueprint that's in the foreground and further away from the player or the camera. You're going to start having problems with lodding. So yeah, this is definitely the best way to go as far as speeding up the engine, saving on texture memory, and saving on polygon count. There's no doubt about it. Doing an array in a blueprint, the best way. Proper hardware instance. Just be careful though, like I said, if the blueprint contains objects way in the background as well as in the foreground, you're going to have problems with lodding. And in which case doing it this way is not going to work. There is, like I said, another way in, I think, 4.15, in Unreal Engine 4.15 and on, Epic Games added the ability to merge your assets together into one object. And doing that can reduce the draw calls. So that's another option as well for you to consider. But again, you've still got to be careful with lodding doing it that way. I haven't used it personally, but there's a command in here. I'm not even sure really where it is, but there's a command where you select all of your objects. Say I wanted, all of these things as one object. I'd select them all and then I'd merge them as one static mesh. And that can reduce the draw calls then. But again, you're still going to save on poly memory and texture memory by reusing your assets basically as much as you can.